She showed up to my daughter's graduation dinner in a suit that cost more than my first car, ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu without asking, and within 40 minutes of sitting down, told me, not asked me, told me, that he expected me to fund their new life together. That was the night I learned that my daughter's boyfriend of 8 months had already spent a year planning how to spend my money. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old, I worked 31 years in commercial heating and cooling, built my business from a single van and a borrowed toolbox, and I know exactly what a man looks like when he's sizing up a room for what he can take out of it. I've hired enough of them. I've fired enough of them too. My daughter, I'll call her my girl, because that's what she is and always will be, even at 26. She called me 2 weeks before her graduation to tell me she'd been seeing someone. His name was Trent. She said it carefully, the way she used to say things as a kid when she already knew I might not love the answer. How long? I asked. Since last October. 8 months she'd kept him from me. I didn't press her on it then. I figured I'd meet him at dinner and form my own opinion. My wife had passed 4 years earlier. Breast cancer, diagnosed in January, gone by August. After that, it was just the two of us. Me and my girl, holding the shape of a family together with whatever we had left. She finished her degree. I kept the business running. We called each other every Sunday without fail. We didn't talk about the empty chair at the table. We didn't have to. So when she called about Trent, I understood why she'd waited. She was protective of what we had. She didn't want to bring someone into it unless she was sure. I wish she'd waited a little longer. We met at a steakhouse in Richmond, her choice, which I was glad of because it's the kind of place I'm comfortable in. Good lighting, good cuts, not trying too hard. I got there early and had a glass of iced tea at the bar while I waited. Old habit. I like to see people walk in before they see me. Trent walked in ahead of my daughter. That was the first thing. He came through the door scanning the room like he was assessing it, then stepped aside and let her follow. Not held the door, let her follow. Small thing. I noticed it. He was maybe 30, clean-cut, with the kind of handshake that's too firm, because someone told him once that's how you show confidence. He smiled with all his teeth. Said he'd heard a lot about me. Said my daughter talked about me constantly. She was beaming. That's the only word for it. She looked at him the way my wife used to look at a problem she thought she'd finally solved. We ordered. He ordered the ribeye and the Camus cab without glancing at the price. I ordered what I always get. My daughter ordered the salmon and looked briefly at the wine list before Trent reached over and closed it gently, already signaling the server. We talked about her graduation, her new position at the firm. She was going into environmental consulting, something she'd worked toward for 3 years, something her mother had known about and been so proud of. I kept my voice steady when we talked about the job. I was proud too. Then, somewhere between the salads and the entrees, Trent leaned back in his chair and said, "Sir, I want to talk to you about something man to man." I set down my fork. He told me he intended to marry my daughter, that he'd thought about it seriously and believed they were right for each other. He said all the things you're supposed to say, and he said them well. Practiced. But then he kept going. He said he had a vision for their future. He said my daughter deserved the best. He said he'd identified a property in McLean. McLean, not a starter home, not a condo, McLean. And that with the current market the way it was, timing was important. He said he also had a business concept he'd been developing, a consulting firm of his own, and that the startup capital required was something he'd been hoping to discuss with family. He used that word, family. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her plate. "What's the number?" I said. He smiled. "Between the property down payment and the business launch, we're looking at around $400,000 to start. $400,000 over a steak dinner. 8 months in. The table went quiet. A server came and topped off the water glasses and left. I picked up my fork again. I cut a piece of my steak. I chewed it and swallowed it and took a sip of my iced tea. And while I was doing all that, I felt my daughter's foot press against mine under the table. Once. Hard. Not an accident. I looked up at her. She wasn't looking at me. But her jaw was tight and her eyes were fixed on her plate with the kind of concentration that isn't really about the food. I said, "Trent, I appreciate you being direct. Why don't you excuse yourself for a moment?" I think I saw the men's room toward the back. He looked momentarily surprised, then smiled again, and stood up and buttoned his jacket on his way to the restroom, like he thought the meeting was going well. The moment he turned the corner, my daughter reached into her purse and slid a folded piece of paper across the table to me without looking up. Her hand was shaking. I opened it under the edge of the table. "Dad, I need help. I didn't know he was going to do this tonight. He's been taking money from me for months. I'm scared. Please don't say yes to anything." I read it twice. I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. Then I reached across the table and put my hand over hers and said quietly, "Okay, sweetheart. I've got it from here." She exhaled like she'd been holding that breath since October. When Trent came back to the table, I was smiling. I told him I needed a few days to look at my liquidity, which was reasonable for a request of that size. He said he completely understood. He ordered dessert. I paid the bill. We shook hands in the parking lot and I watched them drive away in his leased BMW, and then I sat in my truck for 10 minutes in the dark before I could trust myself to drive home. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything I could remember my daughter ever mentioning about Trent. Then I called my son-in-law, my late wife's brother's boy, who works financial fraud for a federal agency I won't name specifically, and I left him a voicemail at midnight that said, "I need a favor. It's about a man named Trent. Call me when you can." He called me at 7 the next morning. By the following Thursday, I knew more about Trent than Trent probably remembered about himself. His real name was on his driver's license, but he'd operated under 2 variations of it across different states. He had a civil judgment against him in North Carolina from 2019. A former girlfriend's family, a loan of $62,000 that was never repaid, litigation that went nowhere because by the time they got to court, he'd relocated to Virginia. He'd had a business registered in Tennessee that dissolved after 14 months with outstanding vendor debts. There was a complaint filed with the Virginia State Bar, not against him directly, but against a firm where he'd been employed as a paralegal, which he'd never mentioned being, and my daughter, in 8 months, had transferred money to him on 4 separate occasions. I didn't know the total yet, she told me later. $23,000, an emergency with his car when he was between insurance coverage periods, a security deposit on an apartment he said the landlord required up front, a medical bill he was too embarrassed to talk about in detail, a bridge loan for a business opportunity that came and went faster than she could ask questions about. She's smart. She's one of the smartest people I've ever known, not because she's my daughter, but because I've watched her think her way through hard problems her whole life. That's the thing people don't understand about this kind of man. He doesn't look for people who are gullible. He looks for people who are trusting. People who extend grace because they were raised to. My wife and I raised our daughter to believe the best in people until they gave you a reason not to. Trent had simply found a way to keep moving the goalpost on the reason. I didn't tell my daughter what I'd found right away. I needed her to keep things calm and normal while I finished what I was doing. So I called her the Friday after the dinner and told her I was taking my time with Trent's proposal, thinking it through carefully, and that she shouldn't let on that anything had changed. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "How bad is it, Dad?" "Let me finish," I said. "Okay," she said. And she trusted me the way she always has. Since she was small, I spent the next week making calls. I have a friend who retired from the Richmond PD and still knows people. I have a lawyer I've used for 20 years. Straightforward man, not cheap, worth every dollar. Between the 2 of them and my nephew, I built a picture that was complete enough to take somewhere. What I wanted wasn't just to get Trent out of my daughter's life. That part I knew how to do. What I wanted was to make sure he couldn't do this to someone else's daughter 6 months from now in a different city. There was also the matter of the $23,000. My lawyer made contact with Trent's lawyer, and yes, Trent had a lawyer, which told you something, through formal channels. We presented the documentation of the 4 transfers, the request framed as demand for repayment on the basis of fraud and misrepresentation. Trent's lawyer called mine and said his client disputed the characterization. My lawyer said we had screenshots of the text messages where Trent had described each emergency in detail, along with proof that at least 2 of the described situations had never occurred. The car insurance lapse, for instance, was contradicted by records showing his policy had been continuous and current. The conversation got shorter after that. At the same time, my nephew passed what he'd found through the appropriate channels. I didn't ask exactly how. I didn't need to know exactly how. What I knew was that the North Carolina judgment and the Tennessee business situation, combined with a new complaint, added up to a pattern that the right people found worth looking at. I called my daughter on a Tuesday evening and told her to come over. She sat at my kitchen table, her mother's kitchen table, the one we've had since she was in grade school, and I walked her through everything, every document, every transfer, every lie, named and dated and sourced. She didn't cry. I expected her to cry. Instead, she got very still and very quiet, the way her mother used to get when she was deciding something. Then she said, "I want to be the one to call him." I said, "Okay." She called him from my kitchen, with me sitting across from her. She told him she knew everything. She told him she wanted the money back. She told him she'd already spoken to a lawyer and that if she didn't hear from him within 72 hours, she'd be filing civil suit and sharing everything she had with law enforcement. She was so calm it was remarkable. Her voice never wavered. He tried 3 things in order. First, he said she was mistaken. Then he said she was being manipulated by people who didn't understand their relationship. Then he said he loved her, and he could explain everything if she'd just meet him in person. She said, 72 hours, Trent, and ended the call. He didn't respond in 72 hours. He responded in 11 through his lawyer, with an offer to repay $18,000 and a request for a non-disclosure agreement. My lawyer said no to the NDA, flat no. They settled on the full $23,000, repaid in 2 installments, in exchange for my daughter not pursuing the civil fraud complaint, which did not preclude any action by anyone else, in any other jurisdiction, based on any other evidence which my lawyer made sure was stated clearly in the agreement. The check for the first installment cleared on a Friday. I remember because my daughter called me when it hit her account, and she said, "It cleared, Dad," and then she started crying. The first time she'd cried through any of it. I sat on my back porch and listened to her cry for a few minutes, and I didn't say anything, because sometimes there isn't anything to say. Then she said, "I should have told you sooner." I said, "You told me when you could." She said, "Mom would have seen through him in 5 minutes." I said, "Your mother would have seen through him before he finished the handshake." She laughed. It was a real laugh. I hadn't heard that in a while. Trent, as far as I know, moved out of Virginia sometime in the following months. There are ongoing matters I'm not in a position to discuss. My nephew tells me periodically that the work continues. That's enough for me to know. My daughter is doing well. She loves her job. She bought herself a small house in Charlottesville with a yard that she's very serious about. She calls me every Sunday. We still don't talk about the empty chair. But sometimes, when we're talking about something ordinary, a recipe she's trying, a project at work, something she saw on a drive, she'll say, "I wish Mom could hear this," and I say, "She hears it," and we leave it at that. I'm not telling this story to make myself sound like a hero. I'm an old man who runs a heating and cooling business and mows his own lawn and goes to bed too early. I miss things I shouldn't have missed. My daughter kept a secret for 8 months because she wasn't sure I could handle adding another worry to the ones I was already carrying, and she wasn't entirely wrong to wonder that. But I want anyone listening to hear this clearly. The men who do what Trent did are not rare. They are not easy to spot. They find people who are open-hearted and tired and hoping for something good, and they are very, very patient. The only thing that worked against him, the only thing, was that my daughter, in the end, asked for help. One note on a piece of paper slid across a table with a shaking hand. You don't have to have it figured out before you ask for help. You just have to ask. The second installment cleared 3 weeks after the first, every dollar back in her account. The suit he probably thought would never fit him properly fit him just fine in the end.